Good day to you. What we're going to look at here is some of the latest research that I've been conducting on public attitudes towards welfare and public services in the midst of the pandemic, really wanting to look to see to what extent attitudes might have shifted on account of the pandemic, and thereby perhaps creating a rather different climate of opinion for policymakers than the one that was in existence before March 2020. Now, to do this, I'm going to show a lot of slides to illustrate some of the results that I've got to show you. As I said, we're going to look at attitudes to public services and welfare. Let me give you some idea of the background to the information that I'm using here. One of the things that we were able to do at the National Centre for Research, with whom I've collaborated on all of this, is to conduct surveys with just over 2,000 people. First of all, in July of last year, so that's basically after the height of the first pandemic and the most serious degree of lockdown restrictions, but at a time when they were beginning to be eased and the first wave of the pandemic was beginning to come down. So that, as it were, gets the instant impact, if any, of the pandemic on public attitudes. And then secondly, we've gone back to people in June of this year, i.e. at a time when the restrictions really were beginning to be eased, although we hadn't quite reached the position that we're in now, where in England at least, pretty much all the restrictions have been eliminated. But that obviously gets us rather closer to perhaps a more long-term potential impact of COVID and the restrictions on people's attitudes. Now, all of the people we were interviewing, mostly online, were people whom we previously interviewed face-to-face in either 2018 or 2019. So one of the things we're going to be able to do eventually is actually look to see who are the people who've changed their views individually. But that does therefore mean we've got a very robust way of comparing the attitudes we've recorded now with the attitudes that were in existence shortly before the pandemic. But in many instances, I'm also looking at questions that have been asked in some cases on a very regular basis on British social attitudes, which is a regular annual high quality survey. It's been going since 1983. So we can not just simply say, well, our attitude is different now from what they were 2 or 3 years ago, but actually look to see whether or not whether the pandemic really is set to be a reset moment in which social and political attitudes in Britain really are very difficult and very different from the ones that we've known in the UK for the last 20, 30, even 40 years ago. How's all of this funded? Well, it's one of the many emergency research projects that the United Kingdom Research and Innovation / Economic and Social Research Council have funded a lot of the research on vaccines and therapeutic remedies for the COVID-19 has been funded through this. Well, there's also been some social science too, to look at some of the societal impacts, and this is part of that. So I'm going to look at 2 fairly broad questions. So I will say to you straight away, because I'm looking over the long term, for the most part, I'm not going to be looking at attitudes to particular policies, because obviously the debate about particular policies moves on from one year to another. And if I'm going to look at how attitudes have looked like now as compared with 30 years ago, clearly we've got to do that at the broad brush. So as you'll see, there's one policy area currently topical where it so happens we do have some more detailed findings. So 2 broad questions I'm going to ask is, well, one of the things, of course, that's happened during the pandemic is that the state has become so much bigger, so much more important. Partly, of course, that's to do with our social lives, and the state has been affecting freedom of movement, how we can interact with others to a very substantial degree. And there's been a debate about that and whether that might have changed attitudes. But the other way, and which is what we're focusing on here, is that the state has spent an awful lot of money. Its role in terms of the economy has expanded very dramatically. And the question that therefore raises is, well, do we want, therefore, a larger state in the longer term, or do we want to return to the normal, something like the status quo ante? The second question I want to ask is that the pandemic certainly has resulted in a lot of discussion about the degree of inequality in British society. Some people have suggested that it's cast a fresh light on it, not least because it's tended to be those living in more deprived neighbourhoods, amongst whom the levels of mortality and morbidity from the pandemic have been higher. But also, actually, of course, the pandemic, the closure of a lot of economic activity, has meant that a lot of people who perhaps felt that they had secure middle-class jobs, all of a sudden were asking themselves, how secure is my job after all? And whether or not, therefore, that exposure to economic uncertainty, together with this greater heightened awareness of inequality, has meant that actually we now think that the welfare state should be doing more, we should have a stronger social security net. Or in the end, are we looking at a society which basically still looks at the world very much through the lens that it had before the pandemic, and it's not really caused us to reassess our views about what we should be doing about welfare in British society? So that's the two broad questions that I'm going to look at. First of all, just a little bit of a preamble, because this is relevant to the first question we're going to look at. What are the forms of state spending that are popular? What are the ones that are less popular? Well, as you can see, and this has been true all the way since the British Social Attitudes started in 1983. Health and education are very popular forms of public spending, and they are, of course, also areas, particularly health, where the state has particularly had to increase its spending during the course of the pandemic. So these are very popular forms of spending. On the other hand, you'll notice that social security spending, so therefore certainly some aspects of welfare spending, have never been, relatively at least, been particularly popular at all. So that's something to be aware of, particularly when we get to look at the question that we have asked on British social attitudes, again, ever since the mid-1980s, which is designed to get at basically people's attitudes towards this broad issue of tax and spend. So it says, suppose the government had to choose, what do you think it should do? Should it reduce taxes and spend less on health, education, and social benefits? So note that health and education are in there. Should we keep them as the same, or should it increase taxes and spend more? Well, this is how attitudes towards this question have moved over the course of the last now nearly 40 years. Now, one of the things that in my political science trade is often talked about when it comes to attitudes towards public spending is that it's argued that what happens is that the public tend to react thermostatically to changes in the level of public spending. So that is, if the government starts spending more on a particular area or on public spending in general, after a while, the public say, well, thank you very much, government. We do now think that the health service is better, or the schools have got better, or whatever, but we're now paying too much in tax than we would like, so could you please stop this? On the other hand, if the government starts to reduce public spending or reduces spending on the health service, the public react by saying, well, it's all fine and well giving us another penny or so in our pocket, but actually the waiting times are too long. The schools are not good enough. Could you please reverse this? In other words, although many a politician perhaps thinks that this is an issue on which people have fixed views and they either want a big state or a small state, actually, it is almost an issue on which it's impossible for politicians to win. The public will tend to react against whatever movement has recently taken place. And this is something illustrated very clearly as to how people reacted both to the attempt to reduce public spending under the regime headed by Lady Thatcher and subsequently John Major, and then how they reacted subsequently to the very substantial increase in public spending instigated by New Labour at the beginning of this century. So the grey line is the people who say keep things who say that we should increase public spending. The orange line is the portion who say keep it as enough. Very few people ever say reduce. But you will notice that after a while, once we got into the middle of Margaret Thatcher's premiership and into John Major's premiership, very, very clear move of people saying, hang on, public services aren't good enough, we should be spending more. Now, this was in truth a message that New Labour said, we don't believe you for quite a while. Eventually, they cottoned on to the fact this was the public move, presided over a very substantial increase in public spending, but then, as you will notice, gradually, as waiting lists reduced, the standard of schooling improved, particularly notably in London. Lo and behold, the popularity of increased public spending declined. We were saying, well, no more, thanks so much. And that for something for a while was sustained in the wake of the financial crash of 2009 and the introduction of austerity by the Conservative Democrat coalition as a way to try and eliminate the fiscal deficit that emerged in the wake of that crash. But as you can see, eventually we started to react against, and more recently, before the pandemic, we've been beginning to say again, please, could we have better public services? But as you might begin to be able to notice from the far right-hand side, not obvious that much has changed during the pandemic. And if we now zoom in on the last 3 years that we've got, the last 2 years, 2020 and 21, are the two post-pandemic surveys, or the mid-pandemic surveys, 2019, the last one beforehand. Well, you can see the proportion of people who say keep things as is has gone up a bit, but there's no really dramatic change. Now, there are two ways of interpreting this. One is that people have reset their thermostat. They've not reacted against the increase in government spending, and that we are living in a different public mood. The alternative interpretation, however, might be is that people have either just not actually adjusted their set and adjusted their thermostat because they've not really taken on board what's happened during the pandemic, and or they're just going, oh, well, this is all exceptional, and actually, the government will indeed go back to where we were. So there are two ways of reading it to that extent, at least. It's we can wait to see what might happen. One thing, however, that we might want to note, and which is perhaps particularly interesting, given that at the moment the Conservative administration seems to be inclined to move in the direction of more public spending than we have had for much of the last decade, is that the political division between Conservative and Labour supporters does seem to have widened during the course of the pandemic. So, for example, if we just take 2018, for example, at that stage, only a 14-point difference between Conservative and Labour supporters in the proportion who say that there should be more taxation and spending. This is never an issue, by the way, that divides voters into Conservative and Labour to anything like the extent that politicians often believe. But now you will notice that the gap between the two sets of supporters is twice as big. It's 28 points. So actually, it may now be a more politically contentious issue, even if the overall balance of opinion, it's not obviously shifted. Now, one of the things, therefore, we might want to do is to say, well, is there other evidence that we've got to look to see, well, are people in some way or another embracing a bigger state in the wake of the pandemic than was the case beforehand? And we've got one or two measures that enable us to get at this, although these are not measures that were asked with the same degree of regularity. And in particular, we are kind of comparing what was going on in the pandemic really over the longer term rather than the position immediately before the pandemic. Exhibit number one is, do we think that the government should help industry to grow? Is that one of its responsibilities? And this is the percentage say it definitely should. No, it's been always something that around 2/5 of people have said definitely should, though it's bounced up and down a bit. It's a bit higher now than it was for the most part in the 80s and the 90s, but not dramatically so, and it's certainly not at an all-time high. I mean, evidently in the wake of the financial crash in 2012, we really did things for something that the government perhaps should be doing. So maybe a bit, but not a lot. Another measure, which is, do we think it's the government's responsibility to provide jobs for all? Something which in effect the government has been getting close to doing with the furlough scheme during the pandemic. Well, a bit higher than it was in 2016 when we last measured, and arguably a bit more than it has been for the most part since the turn of the century, but still not obviously high, if anything, typically rather lower than the position in the 80s and the 90s. So it's not obvious here, for example, despite the economic precariousness of the pandemic, that this has persuaded people that the government should be more active, although of course, so far at least, unemployment has not risen anything like as much as we might have expected in a pandemic. Indeed, we seem to be having a problem with labour shortages, but maybe that's a debate for another day. Finally, however, and this is kind of getting us closer to the issue of public services. One other thing that we can talk about is, we've got measure on, is whether or not major public services and industries should be state-owned or not. Now, this is getting into the question here of partly public services obviously is to do with who should be delivering the health service, who should be delivering education, who should be delivering social care, where there have long been debates about the extent to which the private sector should be helping with the provision of these services, even if they're state funded, and to what extent they should be done by the state. But it's also obviously also partly the debate about some of the former nationalised industries, of which railways have been an obvious one during the pandemic. Our railway system has pretty close to come back to having to be nationalised because of the dramatic fall off in demand for that industry during the pandemic, and we are basically not going to go back to the status quo ante. Well, as you can see, actually, support for having major public service industries being in state ownership perhaps is rather more popular than many people perhaps have appreciated, and despite Labour Party's difficulties in recent elections, actually is a not particularly unpopular point of view. The pandemic certainly hasn't undermined that, and if anything, the proportion of people who disagree is now a little bit lower than it was, although it is 2009 since we previously asked the question. Okay, I said there was one public service in particular where we did have more detailed data. It happens to be the issue of social care. We covered this because this is an area where the extent to which it's something should be funded by government and the extent it should be funded by the individual is a debate that's been going on for some time. It's an area where public policy in England has long been different, particularly from that in Scotland, but also in some respects from the other devolved territories. And so insofar as we were interested again in the theme of what should be the role of the state and should it be bigger or not, this was an obvious, particular issue to look at. So you can see here the question we're looking at. We're looking at who should be paying. We're not looking as to how the government's contribution should be funded, which obviously has been another debate in the last fortnight or so. And essentially what the question does, it enables people to choose between the government basically paying for everything, the individual paying for everything, the individual paying what they can, and then the government paying the rest, which is intended to be roughly in line with the current policy position in England, which is means tested, but until basically your assets have pretty much been whittled away. Then the next option is effectively capping, and the Dole proposal, to which England is now going to move to some degree. And as you can see, the question refers in Wales and Scotland to the devolved administration, not to the UK government. So this gets at the crucial choice on funding that the government in England has recently been addressing. Now, you might have thought that one of the reactions to the experience of the social care sector during the pandemic, and particularly in the first wave, the high level of morbidity that it suffered, is that we would have said, oh, you know, this is just something that the government should be taking over. And indeed, in Scotland, at public policy level, that is the reaction. Scotland is now is going to move towards a national care service. It will go out of the hands of local authorities. It looks as though the provision is going to be much more from the state and not just simply the funding, which is already greater north of the border. But this is not how the public have reacted. Actually, you will see, you know, in both our post-pandemic surveys, support for government funding all the cost of social care is now lower than it was in the relatively recent past. What's become more popular is capping. So it's not that the current system of means testing is particularly popular, it's only around 1 in 4. And certainly nobody thinks it's just something wholly for individual responsibility. But it's interesting to note that actually the capping towards England is moving seems to be relatively popular. It's also interesting to note, and this perhaps helps to explain its relative popularity, and perhaps also why this is the direction in which the government has done. You might have thought, given that, you know, it is older voters who disproportionately, though of course by no means exclusively, end up having to have a degree of social care, that you might think that they were very keen on the government paying, and that you know, older voters these days are much more likely to vote Conservative, and of course also it is older voters who are more likely to have the kind of assets that might potentially be at risk if they have to pay for a lot of social care. On the other hand, of course, traditional Conservative view, which we've already seen, is that, you know, well, we don't want the state to be too big. Individuals should exercise a degree of responsibility. And perhaps the interesting thing about capping is that it hits the sweet spot of the tension between those two instincts. On the one hand, well, actually, we do want to protect the ability of people to be able to pass on some of their inheritance if they've worked hard to their family. But on the other hand, you know, the state shouldn't be paying too much. And as you can see, it is amongst Conservative voters in particular that capping is most popular. And Labour supporters, in contrast, just say the government should be paying for the lot, or at least they're much more likely to say that, although capping is also relatively popular, which perhaps has meant that some of Labour's comments on the moving towards greater government funding is, you know, not perhaps necessarily always caught the mood. But basically, Labour Party would, in a sense, be inclined towards greater government funding. The Conservatives, as compared with Labour, less so, but capping is certainly more popular than the current position. And as you might now have anticipated, it's also relatively popular than amongst older voters, but you will notice it's not amongst younger voters who say, you know, let them eat cake and let them pay for themselves. Yes, younger voters are somewhat more likely to say means test, but they're actually also more likely to say that the government should be paying. So here again, things are perhaps a little more complicated than we might have anticipated. So that's one particular policy area where actually, arguably, the pandemic hasn't had the effect that we might have anticipated. But on the other hand, perhaps as our research has given some indication as to why capping was perhaps an obvious direction for Boris Johnson's administration to go. Well, as we've been focusing on a subject that's perhaps of particular interest to older people, let's, as we move towards looking at the final section of my talk at welfare benefits, to look at attitudes towards pensions. One, of course, of the marked features of the policy of the Conservative Liberal Democrat administration, and arguably also sustained to some degree by Theresa May's administration, was that while welfare benefits for those of people of working age were being squeezed by, for example, not being increased in line with inflation. Pensioners were being protected by the triple lock. And this does seem to have reflected what for a long time was very much the public mood, the feeling that people on retirement and retirement incomes and on state pension were indeed a priority and were part of the deserving poor. And giving people a series of areas for potential welfare spending. Pensions were once by far and away the most popular, certainly all the way through to the end of the new Labour administration, which once got caught out politically for trying to increase the pension by 75p. But we were already seeing signs before the pandemic that perhaps this mood was shifting, albeit with pensions still being relatively popular. We can compare this with attitudes towards whether or not people wanted more or less spending on benefits for the unemployed. Now, as you can see, never been anything like as popular, but something that became markedly less popular during the years of New Labour. And this is going to be a theme that I'm going to repeat more than once as we look at the history of attitudes towards welfare. Labour Party's policy of trying to use welfare in order to get people back to work really did seem to have a marked interest on attitudes towards the provision of welfare for people of working age. And you can see it became markedly less popular here as measured by support for unemployed. But again, we see before the pandemic signs of a shift, that we were beginning to get people saying, well, actually, maybe we should be spending more on, in this instance, people who are unemployed, people of working age, such that, and during the pandemic, at least increasing and spending less have been more or less equally popular, although a lot of people are just kind of saying neither. Now, before we go further into attitudes towards welfare, let's just go and look back at the popular one possible motivation as to why perhaps we think that welfare for people of working age perhaps should be more generous, more liberal than we've been inclined to say it has been in the recent past. And therefore, is it the case that the debate about inequality has changed our perceptions of and reactions to the level of inequality in our society? And here's just a couple of summary measures of ones we've got. Blue line is showing you whether or not we agree that ordinary people do not get their fair share of the nation's wealth. Now, as you can see, this is something that's tended to be very stable over time, ever since the mid-1980s. Around 60% of us have tended to agree with this proposition, although it's tended to be a little bit lower in the last 20 years or so than it was before that, although with some recovery. But it's a bit high, as you can see, it's a bit higher in 2020 and 2021. Not dramatically so, still not necessarily higher than it was in the 80s or 90s, but maybe just a little bit of a sign, and some of our other measures suggest that maybe just a slightly higher level of recognition of inequality in British society. But of course, recognizing inequality and being willing to do something about it are not necessarily the same thing. The orange line is showing you the level of people who agree that the government should redistribute income from the better off to the less well off. Never as popular a proposition as the level of inequality in our society, something which certainly fell off somewhat during the course of New Labour, although pretty much had recovered in subsequent years, but no sign with the two measures on the far right-hand side that we're necessarily wanting to do more about inequality. So let's look a bit more further at, against that backdrop, our attitudes towards a position of the unemployed and also welfare in general. So this is another question that asks people about benefits to the unemployed. The one earlier asked whether or not we should spend more or less. This is asking people whether or not we think that unemployment benefits are too high and basically are a disincentive for people to try and find work, or whether they're too low and cause hardship. The blue line is those who said it was too high, the orange line, those who say too low. Throughout the era of the Conservative administrations of 1979 to 1997, we were much more likely to say that unemployment benefit was too low than it was too high. There was, however, a sharp change in the early years of New Labour, you might now have guessed it, and for much of the New Labour years and into the years of the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, the proposition that it was too high was much the more popular. But prior to the pandemic, there were already signs that this was changing. And here we've got a measure on a regular basis year after year. So we can see that by the time we got to 2017, 2018, 2019, the two propositions were getting to be pretty close to each other. Now, still the case that people are slightly more likely to say it's too low than too high, but for the most part, attitudes, the shift towards more liberal attitudes that were in evidence before the pandemic are still in place. So it's not that the pandemic has necessarily changed attitudes, but that rather the pandemic occurred at a time when we were already thinking that perhaps we should be doing something more about welfare for those of the working age. And here, this is reinforced by a couple of other questions that ask people about their attitudes towards the unemployed. One is, most people around here could find a job if they needed one. As you can see, attitudes towards that were less liberal in the early and mid years of New Labour. They had already changed to somewhat thereafter, particularly in the wake of the financial crash. And the somewhat greater liberalism in evidence prior to the pandemic has certainly been maintained. Most people on the dole are fiddling in one way or another. That kind of more stigmatizing view, very clearly something that we've become less inclined to agree with prior to the pandemic, and that has been, broadly speaking, being maintained. And indeed, again, the same thing. This is now looking generally. If welfare benefits weren't so generous, people would learn to stand on their own 2 feet. Again, even also on this broader message, in the 1980s, we tended to disagree with this proposition. Under New Labour and the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, we tended very sharply to agree with it. However, attitudes were shifting before the pandemic. They have not shifted dramatically during it. So the point is, the pandemic occurred at a time when we were already concerned about the provision for those of working age. That said, some sign, as I've already shown you with attitudes towards social care, that perhaps the political division on attitudes towards welfare may have opened up somewhat. So as you can see, it's been true about both Conservative and Labour supporters are now somewhat less likely to say that people on welfare should learn to stand on their own 2 feet than they were back in 2015. But that during the course of the pandemic, Conservative voters have switched a little bit more towards agreeing with this proposition, Labour voters to some degree moving somewhat away. So it might become somewhat more politically contested territory in future, even if again the overall balance of opinion has not shifted. So to summarise, the public, so far at least, have not reacted against the dramatic increase in public spending. that we've seen during the pandemic, though perhaps the political division on this, on the role of the state, has widened. But to be honest, we can't be sure yet to what extent, if at all, the public have or have not reset their view about the extent to which the state should be involved in the economy, in the delivery of public services, etc. A capped social care funding scheme does now seem to be the single most popular option, and more popular than a wholly government-funded one, which actually now seems to be less popular in the wake of the pandemic. And meanwhile, and perhaps crucially, we are now somewhat more liberal in our attitudes towards welfare for those of working age. But this is something that happened before the pandemic and which has simply stayed with us, which perhaps has helped to ensure that the public have been more supportive and perhaps indeed on occasions have reacted against some of the government's attempts to remove some of the welfare provision during the pandemic. But it's not, doesn't indicate that we've become more sensitive towards it. So the big headline, although there's been an awful lot of commentary amongst commentators about how the pandemic might create a different society, creates an opportunity for a new reset moment, the prosaic truth may well be is that the public mood that policymakers are going to have to deal with in the post-pandemic world onto which we are now gradually beginning to enter may well look very familiar, and that if the role of the state is going to change in whatever direction, politicians may need to persuade the public that this is something that is indeed should happen, because at the moment, at least, the pandemic itself has not necessarily persuaded them that that indeed is something that needs to happen. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you've found that informative. And of course, this is an ongoing research project, and we'll be saying more about how public attitudes have or have not shifted in the wake of the pandemic in the coming weeks and months. And if you keep an eye on the website of the National Centre for Social Research, you'll be able to find out more about this research as it is gradually emerging into the public domain.